it's Tessa from HandleTheHeat.com, and in my last video I showed you how to make a homemade sourdough starter, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use that starter to make homemade sourdough bread. Now I know sourdough can be so intimidating, so I'm going to be showing you every step along the way, and it's actually super easy, and if you watch all the way through the end you'll learn all the tips and tricks, including how to make it ahead of time and how to troubleshoot if you do experience any issues along the way. So if you'd like to learn how to make homemade sourdough bread, then just keep watching. Alright, so to get started with this basic sourdough bread recipe, the day before we are actually going to feed the starter. So I have just a portion of my starter here, and I fed it with a little bit of bread flour and a little bit of purified water, and I'm just going to let that do its thing overnight, and then the next day is when I'm going to get started with the dough. So with sourdough bread and with any bread in general, I always like to weigh out all of my ingredients. It's so important, and it will pretty much guarantee that your bread is going to turn out, as opposed to using measuring cups. And so for this recipe I've actually used only weight measurements, and I'll link to the scale I use below, and it's really important to invest in a scale when you are into baking because it'll just make a world of difference. So I've weighed out 500 grams of bread flour, and the reason we're using bread flour is because it has high gluten protein content, way more than all-purpose flour, which will help give the sourdough bread structure, because the acidity of the sourdough starter tends to make the sourdough kind of slack and loose, so we need that protein in the bread flour. So in my stand mixer, I have 150 grams of active fed sourdough starter, and you want to make sure your starter is very active and recently fed, and I have more information and a schedule for you to use in the blog post linked below. And you can test how active your sourdough starter is by placing a teaspoon of it in some water, and if it floats, that means it's ready to use. So I've also added 250 grams of bottled water, and you want to make sure to use bottled water because regular tap water typically has chlorine in it, which will actually kill the yeast. And since in this recipe the only yeast that exists is actually in the sourdough starter, we have to be really delicate and careful with it. I've also added in 25 grams of olive oil and just giving that a stir, and I'm going to use my hands to get in there and just get it all together into a cohesive, shaggy mass. And I'm actually going to let this rest for about 15 to 30 minutes because the gluten or the flour needs to absorb all the water, and letting it rest is really going to make a big difference. The other thing that's going to make a big difference is actually waiting to add the salt until after that rest period. I'm adding in 10 grams of fine sea salt right now, and that is because salt can actually kill yeast. And again, we just need to be very delicate with that yeast. So once the dough has been kneaded for about 5 minutes in my standing mixer, you can of course always knead by hand. It is nice and smooth and cohesive and soft. I'm just going to shape it into a ball and put it in a well-oiled bowl, and I'm going to kind of roll the dough in the oil, and the oil is going to help prevent the dough from sticking so that it can rise fully and it doesn't get stuck everywhere. So just covering that bowl with plastic wrap, and I'm going to let it rise in a warm area until it's doubled in size. And the amount of time it takes to rise will totally depend on the environment and the starter and how active it was. It can take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours all the way up to 12 hours. So you can actually let the dough rest overnight in the fridge. And so you can actually use your hands to leave indents in the dough, and if the indents remain, that means that your dough is fully risen. If the indents pretty much just spring right back, that means your dough is not fully risen and you need to let it rise for a little bit longer. So I actually like to make 2 smaller loaves with this recipe. So I will save the remaining dough for a later date, just pop it in the fridge or the freezer. And I am shaping this little ball of dough into a very, very tight ball. And I'm just doing that by kind of pulling the sides up and over and down to the bottom. And we want to make sure the ball is nice and tight because that's going to give it its shape. So I am placing the ball of dough in a cornmeal dusted Dutch oven and covering it, letting it rise until doubled in size, about 1 to 2 hours, and you can do that indentation test again. You just really want to make sure that you're not overproofing, because overproofing the dough will lead it to collapse and result in a pale crust, and it just won't be as good. Okay, so now we're scoring the bread. Take a sharp knife and just cut a little, about a 2-inch cut. I actually probably made mine a little too small. So now we're going to cover and we're ready to bake. So I've actually preheated the oven to 450 degrees. And then the second I place the pot in the oven, I'm going to reduce the temperature to 400 degrees. And I'm going to bake covered for 20 minutes, then remove the lid and continue to bake for another 35 to 40 minutes or until very golden brown. And during the last minute of baking, you can actually crack the oven door open just slightly to allow some moisture to escape, and that's going to result in a crisper crust. So the sourdough is actually done when you can register the internal temperature at around 205 degrees, and look how absolutely beautiful and perfect it is. And sourdough, besides the awesome taste, actually lasts longer than regular bread. Alright, so my sourdough is out of the oven and it's all cool and it's a perfect, beautiful loaf, and the house now smells like a San Francisco bakery, and I can't wait to take a slice, smear a bit of butter on top, and it's going to be perfect. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and share it with any friends who are sourdough lovers. And I'll catch you around next time in another food video soon.